Yo, hello. We are back once again with the updated Heroic Grail tier list, this time for the month of July. And I feel like this time around there really wasn't a lot. We did get a lot of new skills, but they felt more like variants of older skills that we already got, and new units and refines that were still relatively nice in their own, but don't really make that much of an impact. The big thing going forward this time around is definitely going to be the arena change I have for the video, so hopefully that'll be worth your while. Regardless, there's still plenty to discuss, and yeah, we may as well just get right into it. Before anything else, there are the must-knows for context. You can skip this if you're already familiar, but just in case anybody's new to this, there are 3 tier lists based on the most relevant modes in the game for Aether Raids, Summoner Duels, and Arena, and depending on where each unit places on each individual list will determine what the final tally is at the end of the video, aka the units I personally recommend building up at this current time. And something I should have also had here for added clarity is that I always take max investment into consideration because that's usually how their biggest potential is going to be. So you can take any list on its own individual basis, and if you have any questions or feedback, leave it in the comments and I'll get to it as soon as I can. But for now, we may as well get right into the Aether Raids tier list. As far as updates go on the Aether Raids tier list this time around it's not exactly as big as it was on a lot of other lists, but we still have plenty to discuss, including Kemp's refine, 2 of the new units, and a lot of flyer buffs actually. For starters, I do want to talk about Kemp because his placement didn't really change, even though his refine was relatively decent for the most part. He gets damage reduction on the first hit, he gets stats, and he inflicts discord on allies as long as he's able to get his attack off, which is really convenient for just damage output. I think the best thing you could probably do with Kemp at this time is make him into a really obnoxious unit that is hard to take down. Basically stack his defenses so you could get Venom Edge off way more easily, and if he's able to fall into the Wings of Mercy range, you could have additional allies teleport in. I think he works best on something like Dark Season just because he also has the flash prevention, and you're not necessarily going up against saves in something like Light Season because Emblem's feud and null save effect, which makes it really difficult to omni-tank unless you're someone like Lucia. I think he can still be a relatively good unit for just setting up a lot of debuffs and just shutting off a lot of omni-tanks. But one thing I definitely value at this current time is just having it ready from the get-go. So somebody like Walhart, for example, you could just inflict flash immediately, doesn't necessarily have to worry about getting their weapon off. Even though Kemp really shouldn't be struggling as much, there's always that possibility that lingers that he's not going to be able to get Venom Edge off completely. Regardless, I do think it is a good weapon refine, and I don't think it really changes much for him. It just makes him a lot more obnoxious. Other than that, we got Summer Donald and Zephyr. Summer Donald is basically your new Axe demote with really high BST. I'm pretty sure he scores the same as Lumera despite lacking a PRF, which is really great, but he doesn't really have much going for him outside of just really high attack and defense, which can still be really good for melee specialist roles, but as a green tank, it's not really the best position to be in at this time. Regardless, you can still make use of a lot of infantry stuff because, yeah, infantry get everything in the world, so it's not the worst thing for him. But yeah, he's basically your new generic Axe with big stats in certain areas and lacking in others. And as for Zephyr, she's basically our new Aversa, except relatively decent this time around. My biggest issue initially with Aversa is that she generally had to choose between her offensive capabilities and her supportive gimmick with her panic and pluggy stuff, so it definitely came at the cost of a lot of offensive capabilities. But with Zephyr, she does have unconditional panic within 5 spaces, and she has no follow-up, meaning that she could reliably double if needed, which in my opinion is probably what they should have given Aversa as her refine. But regardless, we have Zephyr now, and she's just a complete upgrade. The comparisons aside, Remote Sparrow and Brush Assault 4 mean that she could also just get a good amount of damage reduction, and she could reliably initiate combat, which is really good. The only thing I'm concerned about at this time, and this isn't even just a Zephyr Aversa issue, it's just a panic-wide issue, is that there's so many counterplays to the status at this point that it may not necessarily be as beneficial to have around. You know, we have Unity Robin, which could be ran on every Aether Raids defense team. We have null panic, null penalties from a lot of mythics and a lot of units that could just get it on a refine, or they even have it innately with their PRF. I think the nice thing though is that she does have plugins, so even in situations with Unity, she could still cancel out one of them. Regardless, she does have access to a really nice weapon, and she has incredibly good offenses, so I'm not as worried about her performance as I am with a lot of other units, but it's still something that should be considered nonetheless. Otherwise, before going into the area with all the promotions and the demotions, I do want to quickly mention the addition of newer skills that we already got, including Spurn 4 and Flash Sparrow, which are really nice upgrades for a lot of your defensive and offensive units. Spurn 4 could just give you additional damage with your Godlike Reflexes build, which is always really nice, and Flash Sparrow can be really nice on a defensive team where you could just get additional cooldown for a relatively easy check, but both of these skills aren't definite changes to any sort of unit that already didn't make them really good to begin with. The only other thing is Aether, who has the new Arcane Nihility and Beast Sense 4, which are relatively good for what it's worth, but because there aren't a lot of Beast Calves in the Grail shop, the amount of units that are really going to be taking advantage of these skills to the point where their placements really change in the Aether Raids isn't really that high, but they are nice skills to have regardless. Other than that, there's the decent tier where I ended up promoting a lot of the bow flyers and bow calves because Arcane Dark Bow from Alchrist is a really nice weapon, aka gives them no follow-up and it gives them stats and desperation, so if you put them on a catcher ball or any sort of team that allows them to double, then they're getting 4 attacks out before the foe can counter, which is incredible. It's not the only reason I necessarily promote them now, but for the sake of brevity, the only other skill that really came into play this month was Soaring Guidance, which is basically drive no follow-up for all your infantry and flyers, and they get the warp effect. So even in a scenario where we didn't have Arcane Darkbow, they still had access to no follow-up, and because both arcanes are relatively strong, I honestly think fast bow flyers are in a really nice position right now. Granted, they're not exactly the strongest of the bunch, but I would say they're relatively competent if you have the right stat line. For that reason, I ended up promoting Summer Alencia and Spring Loki. I also promoted Bridal Louise and Halloween Rolf and a lot of the other bows that fall into that category because they can still use stuff like Arcane Darkbow, and they have access to a good amount of skills that at least allows them to double consistently, including Lulled, Speed Defense, and because they have good range, they could also take advantage of menaces. Other than the bows, I also promoted a couple of the slower swords and a couple of the infantry blue tomes, mainly because we now have access to Seashell Bowl and Attack Defense Finish. Seashell Bowl, while it doesn't really have additional effects, is just a massive stat swing weapon, which is really good for not only getting damage out, but also getting consistent doubles. Seashell Bowl just gives a free plus 15 attack and speed, and you could refine it so you could get additional speed on top of that. Donald's weapon also does the same thing, except it's an attack defense buff, which is still really good. But Seashell Bowl in particular allows for a lot of these other units that don't have access to the best weaponry to begin with to function relatively well with the weapon itself. The only caveat is really going to be that you kind of just have to attach it to a catcher ball, but that's a lot of nukes nowadays anyway, and I don't think that's really the biggest deal. And as for the slower swords who have really decent attack and good mixed bulk, or relatively high defense, they're going to be promoted because of attack defense finish and access to Wyvern Katana and a lot of the other infantry skills that can make them really decent melee specialists. I have always been an advocate of dual phase brave weaponry because of the ability to just double no matter what. And while the Wyvern weapons that we did get last year aren't exactly high in might, the ones that do still have relatively good attack and mixed bulk can take advantage of these really well. Even with the attack penalty, they can still hit relatively hard for what it's worth. And because of that, I think with attack defense finish and all their skill accessibility such as Spiral 4 and Times Pulse 4, with Wyvern Katana in tow, they can easily tank what they need to tank in something like Astra Season and pair them up with a far save and they should be good to go. And lastly, I want to quickly talk about Fallen Delthea's demotion because the big thing she had at the time was her ability to warp around and get a lot of stats, which she can still do, but it's not unique to her anymore, especially with all the additions that we've been getting for warping effects such as Guidance 4 and Soaring Guidance. And now we have Seashell Bowl, which also grants an absurd amount of attack and speed that she was already getting. The one thing she does have over them is the innate lull, which is always beneficial, but in my opinion, it's not so big of a drastic jump that she needs to be a tier above or below them, which is why she did demote here. And lastly, I want to quickly talk about the other demotions, including Winter Bruno, Winter Cecilia, and Winter Jafar. The big thing here is that they're just ranged armors, and as nukes become harder and harder hitting, it's going to be harder and harder for them to tank, even with all the skill accessibility that they have, including the new Armored Flow and Beacon skills. And even for somebody like Winter Bruno who could double or triple unity stack on something like an Aether Raids defense team, he's still a green unit and they can easily go in turn 1, so it's not always foolproof in that regard. I think they could still work in the right setting, but as far as consistency goes, it's definitely going to be a lot more hit or miss, especially for the dagger ones who don't really have access to good weaponry to begin with. And that's going to be about it for the Aether Raids tier list. Next, I want to move on to the Summoner Duels tier list, you know, the mode that everybody loves. And there's actually a fair amount of stuff to talk about with the Summoner Duels tier list changes, but before I go into a lot of those, I do want to quickly talk about the new refine and the 2 new units that we did get. I think this one's going to be a lot more concise. Kempf can still work in this setting, but in my opinion, his weapon really isn't built around Summoner Duels. He has to inflict a lot of stuff with his weapon, which is so relatively easy to do in something like that. But in my opinion, he doesn't really fulfill a niche in something like Summoner Duels with Venom Edge. The big combo when it comes to Summoner Duels stuff right now is that you run a melee specialist or somebody who can frontline really, really well, and then a far save in the back, because you can only run 1 save on any given team. He's probably not going to have the flash effect consistent enough to where any of the notable far saves are going to be worried about it. While they could still be hit by flash, it's easy enough for you to just remove the effect after ending their turn whenever you so feel like it. And you can still make him relatively obnoxious if you stack up his speed and defense so that he could just become a relatively bulky wall. But in my opinion, you'll have to build around him to get him really, really going, which will also include limiting his movement potential so that he could always fall back in the far save or protection range, which it can still work, but I don't think it's so compelling that he can really, really get going on a lot of teams from the get-go. And as for Donald, it's pretty much the same deal as a lot of your other generic infantry. He has a really high amount of attack and defense, but he is a green tank, which isn't exactly the best. He can still be used with relatively okay success if you were to pair him up with the right allies. But the moment any sort of notable player phase red unit comes into play, which will pretty much be often because of how common red nukes and red units are in Summoner Duels he's gonna fall relatively fast. I think the big thing is that you try to make him as obnoxiously tanky as possible, rather than trying to focus on any sort of ability to get damage output, because he's really just going to be there to try and frontline, in my opinion. He has plenty of stats to do that, but again, the big thing is just that he's green, so it's not really the best color for him at this time. And as for Zephyia, I think this is where my panic issues really come into play, because Eliwood and Legendary Ramen are everywhere, meaning that she's not really going to be able to get a lot of her effects off with a relative success. She can still get a plug-in effect, which is still relatively nice and cancel out one of the unities, but in terms of consistency or just hindering or helping the team, it's not really going to be all that big. And it is nice that it is unconditional, but as it currently stands, I don't think panic effects are really that good at the moment, just because of how much it either doesn't mean anything to a lot of the team, or how much it can actively hinder it if they have a Legendary Robin, which he's going to be very, very common because he's just incredibly strong. But she still does have access to no follow-up. She gets a good amount of offensive capabilities, and she has access to guidance, which is really, really nice. So she's not exactly a lost cause in my opinion. But now I want to talk about the promotions and demotions that we got this time around. I think the big thing going forward is units that not only provide support, but also have decent utility to boot. Because power creep is going up the wazoo and a lot of units are able to do a lot more things, I think with the limited amount of slots that you have per Summoner Duels team, you would want to start running support units that can not only provide decent support, but could also provide other benefits to the team, such as, you know, a frontline dancer who can not only allow allies to teleport in, but they can then dance them and then allow them to either act again or move out of the way for relatively good defensive measures. I think having support in and of itself is already really, really good, but I think the big thing going forward are going to be units that have access to a good amount of utility, so they're not stuck doing the one thing, and if they aren't able to do the one thing, then they're still able to do other things, which is why I'm promoting Bridal Larum and Masquerade Eldigan. He isn't nearly as fast, but that's fine because he has a really good amount of physical bulk, and you can just not only continually stack that, but he is blue, so he still has a relatively good tanking color, which is really, really nice. The same thing is really also going to go for Summer Fiora and Thief Rickard, and that's just because they also have access to Florid Cane, which not only allows them to enter combat, but they can then retreat back afterward and still be in guard bear and guidance range for your allies to teleport in, which is really, really nice. And as for Fallen Delthea, it's going to be a relatively same thing as it was in the Aether Raids tier list, because we're getting access to a lot more warping shenanigans. She doesn't exactly do something unique, and while she is a relatively good unit as is, her gimmick isn't nearly as compelling when a lot more units can do the same thing nowadays. And one other thing going forward, as you're going to see with a lot of the demotions, is that, yeah, we have a lot, and I mean a lot, of red armor killers. And that's not only going to be a problem for units that are green, but for the ones that also don't have access to Hardy Fighter or or a lot of other stuff that would allow them to properly tank. So as far as the trend is concerned, you're going to see a lot of green armor demotes, and a lot of ranged armor demotes. But regardless, I did also want to bring mention to a lot of the other promotions, including Summer Alencia, Spring Loki, and New Year Yarn. The big thing again is just that they have access to Arcane Darkbow, which is really, really good. And because of Soaring Guidance being a thing, they aren't necessarily attached to that too. They can run the old Arcane and run Unity instead, especially if you plan to run them on a legendary Robin team. The new Arcane doesn't work with him because it neutralizes penalties, so you could still use the old one, have it with the damage reduction, still potentially quad, and have a failsafe in case advantage, which is really, really good. I think they're doing relatively great as of right now, but I think the big thing is that you just have the proper sets to do it. Spring Loki is definitely pushing it because her attack isn't exactly the best at base, but she can still make up for it with the right tools in hand. The other promotion I did want to talk about was New Year Yarn, because now we have access to Beast Sense 4, and Arcane Nihility is also really nice because it provides no follow-up and slaying and a lot of other stuff. But I think the big thing is that we also have Beast Sense 4, which is just pure damage reduction based on speed, and it removes the Beast Transformation gimmick, which makes team composition issues less of an issue, which is really, really nice. Arcane Nihility is especially good for Yarn because his whole weapon was really built around Gale Force, and Gale Force really isn't that great of a special when it comes to Summoner Duels, but because of this newfound accessibility, I figured it'd be worth pushing him up to decent. The other units I want to quickly talk about when it comes to demotions were Reeve and Murdoch, and it's going to be a lot of the green armors too, because, you know, Legendary Hinoka and a lot of red armor killers are really, really prevalent, and they just can't do anything, and if you lose your far save, that's a big deal. Reeve in particular, I think could still work in the right setting because stall is still relatively good, but it's not only easy to build around because it targets the lowest speed unit, but because there's also just a lot of warping effects all around. I don't think just having stall is enough nowadays, which is why I'm pushing him down to decent. He does also have slaying in his tome, which is good for just charging up AoEs if you want him to do stuff like that, and he does have higher res, so he can still get through stuff like Dragon Wall and Scowl and all that, but otherwise he is another one of those one-trick ponies at this time. And as for Murdoch, it's relatively self-explanatory. He's a relatively good min-maxed armor, but in the context of Summoner Duels, he's not really going to be functioning as well because everything kills green armors, and it's really, really sad. You could try and make him a near save, but that's really, really pushing it, especially since a lot of the biggest threats happen to be ranged. But even so, he could still function with the right team, but the moment you run into any sort of red armor killer, it's pretty much done for him. And the last bit of changes come from Can Work, and I don't know, man. I think the other thing going forward is going to be access to piercing specials or piercing skills, because everything has damage reduction, and it's such an important effect to get damage out that I think that any sort of unit that doesn't have access to any sort of damage piercing effects isn't really going to be functioning as well in something like Summoner Duels, which is why I'm not only demoting somebody like Aversa, but I'm also promoting stuff like Halloween Rolf and Brada Luis and all those, mainly because they do have access to Deadeye and the new arcanes, which a lot of them will function relatively well, but not so much to the point where they're probably going to be so amazing, but I think they could still work. Otherwise, we have Marum, and he has access to Beast Sense 4, which is really, really good. I think the biggest issue for me is that Wild Tiger Fang just self-inflicts damage, which isn't exactly the best, but with Beast Sense 4, you can still shrug off a good amount of damage if needed, which is relatively nice, and it still removes that weird transformation gimmick that he does have built into his weapon, regardless of which allies he's near. That in and of itself is good, and I don't think the overlap is really the biggest worry here. I think the biggest thing is that he just self-inflicts damage, so if you're really just trying to get him to tank or do any sort of frontline shenanigans, it's going to be a bit more difficult as he's continually chipping away his health, but I don't think it's so bad that he has to be in the I don't know man tier. And as for Narshian, who's probably the only other promotion here, it's mainly because of Wooden Tackle. He doesn't exactly have the best stat line as is, but Wooden Tackle could give him 15 free attack and defense, so if you just need a really obnoxious bulky unit to frontline, he could definitely do it, especially with guard bearing and guidance. I think he's gonna do okay enough, even though his stat line isn't exactly the best, but Wooden Tackle gives such a big stat swing that I don't think it really matters in a lot of scenarios. And other than that, it's really just gonna be a lot of armor demotes because, yeah, red armor killers. And if I'm demoting Murdoch because he's not really able to function as well due to all these prevalent threats, I'm most definitely not gonna be keeping the ones that don't have a PRF, and I'm especially not keeping the ones that don't have access to Hardy Fighter or any sort of good defensive skill that allows them to act as a really, really good tank, especially for the ranged ones, which they can still potentially maybe function, but their weapon accessibility outside of Bruno is really questionable, and Bruno himself is also really questionable. questionable because he's a green tome, which, you know, isn't really gonna prove well, especially if you can't double through Hinoka. But regardless, I'm pretty sure he still dies through effective damage through Hinoka and a lot of these other units, so I'm not really as keen on that. And otherwise, it's just male Chris, which really just a fix for Groom Marth because I didn't realize they were in different tiers, but hey, that's on me. And that's going to be about it for the Summoner Duels list. Lastly, there are the arena changes, and I did add something to this section so that it's a bit more fleshed out, because prior it was always like these 1 to 2 minute sections of like, these are units that score well, here are the units that don't. And that's going to be the beginning of this, where Summer Donald scores 760 points in arena, which is really, really good. It's still around the same level as somebody like Lumera, which, you know, if you want to build Donald for arena, you can, but Lumera is also right there and has a PRF, which is really, really good. But I think the big thing going for him is that if there are future arcanes that allow him to function really, really well, you could still use that and you still won't lose score for it, which is really good. And otherwise, Zephyr and Kemp, they pretty much score the same. They both rely on dual skills to properly score into the 180 range. And with that, they can end up scoring 756, which is still okay, but I don't think it's so good that you should really be using them for scoring. But it's definitely a lot better than the ones in 754 and anybody below that, because if you're really trying to use them for scoring, it's definitely not going to be the best time for you unless they are somehow a bonus, which can definitely be a thing, but it's not always going to happen. And because of how many Grails there are in the Grail shop, it's definitely going to take a while before them to rotate in. And really, if you're looking to build any unit for scoring, I would definitely consider the first 2 tiers more so than anything else, but 756 range isn't exactly the worst, especially if you're just trying to maintain tier 19, tier 20. And this is where the news section comes in. I think if you do end up building any of these units regardless, you definitely have to consider what your matchups are, because some seasons are definitely going to be better for them than others. For example, in Water Season, there are a lot of blue units and a good amount of ranged units, so any sort of decent green tank can function there relatively well. In Earth Season, you don't really want anybody with damage reduction properties because Nana will just absolutely kill them, and there's a lot of Miracle there too, and so on and so forth. Based on the current allocation of legendaries in Arena, I compiled a list of units that you probably would want to consider for certain seasons if you do plan on building them for scoring. For example, in Fire Season, I think a big thing for them is that you either run physical red tanks, one-tappers, or counter prevention. There are a fair amount of units that can not only counterattack at 1 range, but 2 range, because some also have innate DC, some also have a good amount of warping and cancel effects. There's also one with Hardy Bearing, so you can't even use Vantage against a lot of them if that so happens to show up. And because a lot of them are comprised of red and green with the occasional blue, I think you run somebody that could potentially one-tap or can tank relatively well, and I think your best tanks are definitely going to come from the red area, especially for the faster ones or the ones that have access to guard bearing. Any of those can definitely hold off relatively well, and because the only really prevalent blue threat is going to come from Shez, you don't necessarily have to run them with DC, and I'm pretty sure a lot of them need to run R-Duel anyway, so you can have Farsave in the back to protect them. As for Water Season, I think the big thing is that you run green and blue tanks, speedy infantry that aren't swords because of the amount of blue threats that there are there, and dancers. And the reason I say dancers is because of Legendary Chrome's ability to just take another action after repositioning, which is really, really good. Dancers don't necessarily score the best anyway because Dancer's only 150 SP, but if you do want to run a Dancer for ease of clearing, you could still definitely do that, and I do think Water Season is probably the best for them. But otherwise, you can still run a lot of green and blue tanks because, again, the big thing is that they're just really, really heavy in blues in this area, and while there could also be potential issues with somebody like Legendary Ninian who gets the sweep effect against every blue unit, with the right skills you should be able to shrug it off anyway, especially from somebody that has access to guard bearing, because it's a really annoying skill to have. But even so, any sort of notable blue or green tank should be able to deal with them relatively well. And as far as Earth Season goes, I think this is probably where it's going to be the most all over the place, because there are a lot of effects here. We got damage reduction, we got miracle, we got anti-damage reduction properties, we have a unity and debuffs. There's a lot here, and I think for a lot of them, rather than trying to fight against it, you try and take it to your own advantage. For example, you could try and use somebody with access to unity weapons and potentially stack up the wazoo with them. So if you have a Legendary Robin on your team, then they can become really obnoxious with the right skills. But if you don't want to try and deal with them, you could try and run a bunch of sweep or dazzle units that would potentially remove Robin's 25% HP threshold. This one might be a bit more difficult given that he just gets a lot of stats, but but you could also try and run some sort of Pain Savage Blow thing if the score doesn't hinder you all too much. But otherwise, you could try and run some sort of blue near save or really good player phase green unit. Near saves are probably not going to be the best when it comes to Nana anyway, because first off, they don't have access to Hardy Fighter because it doesn't score well enough in Arena. But second, she just shreds through a lot of units. But blue near saves with a really good amount of HP and bulk should be able to deal with her anyway, even if they end up taking a good amount of damage in the process. The big thing is that you just run them as near saves because this season is also really prevalent in ranged threats. The best thing you could definitely do is run some sort of armor with near save, especially since Alm could come in and just take them out at 2 range. It's not really the best thing to do there. And the other thing is that you potentially run some sort of offensive green unit so that they can deal with stuff like Legendary Fa, Deirdre, Julia, a lot of the blue threats, and a lot of the ones that are relatively squishy as is. Nana isn't even bulky, so even in terms of red threats, the only one that really comes to mind is Ike, but you're not really going to be dealing with him all too much because it's Legendary Ike and he's not really that good anyway. And lastly, there's Wind Season, which also has a good amount of variety, but I think the big thing is that you're really going to be taking advantage of visible buffs, or you're going to be taking advantage of plugin effects, because not only do you have stuff like Gunthra and Legendary Lucina, but you also have Eliwood, who can not only grant a bunch of bonuses, but he also has Kanto and Null Panic for your allies. So for units that just want a stat stack, you could definitely run them on that season and become a really big ball of stats. Otherwise, you could try and take advantage of the debuffs that a lot of these legendaries do provide, which allows units such as Aversa and Zephyr to function really, really well in that regard. Otherwise, I think there's just a lot of room for stuff like Hidden Run and Guard and Scout Dragons, because while there are a good amount of units that have a really good range, you know, Yuri, Veronica, Sigurd, I think a lot of them are just relatively okay as is. So if you're able to run a Gale Force set with something like Chiang or any sort of a special acceleration that allows them to charge Gale Force really, really easily, then I think you're going to have a way better time player facing them than potentially trying to enemy phase them, especially against stuff like Veronica, Yuri, and Micaiah, who could just shred through armors really, really easily. The other thing is definitely going to come with Scowl Dragons, especially if they're able to run Scowl without sacrificing any sort of score. I don't think Garen is able to, which does suck, but he does have a really good PRF with Scowl in tow. The big thing is that you're just able to shut down a lot of specials this way, which allows for a lot more ease of tanking. But I think the biggest worry is definitely going to come from units like Veronica, who have tempo. Even so, for the ones that are able to shut down those specials really, really easily, they're going to end up tanking a lot better than a lot of other units would otherwise, especially since they also have access to Distant Counter Seal, which also means they can counter back if needed. And really, when it comes to considering any sort of arena stuff, this is probably your best bet here. And finally, before closing up the video, I do want to quickly mention my personal picks when it comes to what you could build in the Grail shop. I think your best options when it comes to specifically looking for certain game modes or certain units to fulfill a certain niche, that you could either build a lot of the melee flyers, because right now melee flyers are some of the best archetypes that you could have right now. Bridal Larum, Masquerade Eldigan, Summer Shez have a really good mixed utility, especially the dancers who can not only dance but also frontline really, really well. Shez can initiate combat and go back afterward because he has Kanto built into his weapon. You have scoring and save oriented units such as Lumera, Zephyr, and Vigard. Zephyr obviously doesn't score that well, but he's still a really good save unit. And arguably, as for your best flying tanks, you have Cynthia, Har, and Carmag. The last two who have access to true damage reduction, which means stuff like Guard Bearing will make them one of the most obnoxious tanks in the game. And Cynthia, who has a Unity weapon, meaning that she could triple stack Unity with Legendary Robin and become a really big powerhouse of stats. I think if you're going to build any unit at this time, these 9 are probably going to be the best. But I think it's also worth mentioning that we are getting a CYL GHB next month, so there's also a good chance that they can end up being really, really good. But yeah, if you have any questions or concerns, let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.